because I am here to talk about Ayn Rand's ideas, you all and everyone already agrees with what I'm going to say, so that's pretty simple. So Ayn Rand talk about some heat on the stage. Ayn Rand's a controversial thinker, and she brings some really interesting and I think correct ideas to the issue of freedom, and I want to talk about some of those today. I think it's pretty clear that the effort to make economic and historic arguments in favor of liberty has not gone well for us as sort of the primary or sole thing that we do in the liberty movement. So ever since Adam Smith, economists have been able to explain pretty clearly how it is that free markets help to deliver the goods and help to rise the standard of living of everyone. Historic arguments, if we look back and you say, well, look, socialism doesn't work, right? It leads to mountains of corpses and rivers of blood. We can see this in history. We have petri dishes such as East Berlin and West Berlin. We have North Korea and South Korea. We have the USSR and the United States. We've got all sorts of historic examples to show us that socialism, or statism more broadly, leads to human suffering, misery, and death. Yet, today, I think just a few days ago, in Berlin, they passed a law to nationalize properties, housing units of big corporations. In South America, we have Venezuela converting. This is the land with the most natural resources probably on the planet, and it's now poverty-stricken. Why? Because it's decided to try socialism again, as if the historic record doesn't show us that this is a bad idea. And in the United States, we have people advocating socialism once again here in the land of liberty that became the most prosperous place in the history of the world, precisely because of the freedom that the founding fathers instilled here. So the idea of trying to argue that, look, the economics of a free market shows that this is better, or look, history tells us that that socialism doesn't work. These are important facts, but they are insufficient if we want to defend liberty. We need more than economic and historic arguments. We need moral and philosophic arguments. We need moral and philosophic arguments. And the reason we know that we need those is because when we look at the advocates of socialism and statism, they are winning precisely because they are using moral and philosophic arguments. They're not good arguments, they're bad arguments, but they are using moral arguments. They're saying, what about the poor? What about the students? What about the children? It's all some consequence to people who are not having the same opportunities or the same amount of wealth as other people. And that lever helps them to become the spokespeople for the next generation, right? Because the young kids coming up who are starting to try to figure out what matters to them in this world, they're concerned about right and wrong. They're not concerned about economics for the most part, and they don't know anything about history for the most part, but they are concerned about what's right and wrong. So Ayn Rand, in my view, brings to the table for people who want to advocate liberty some really important tools. And I want to talk about three of them today. I'm going to move pretty quickly through three things that Ayn Rand has done some really important thinking on that I urge people to look further into if you haven't. And they are rights, so individual rights, the nature of rights, morality, specifically the difference between traditional morality, altruism, the idea that you should being moral consistent, self-sacrificially serving others, as against her view of morality, which is that being moral consistent, pursuing your values, and respecting the rights of others to do the same. Very different moral codes. And then also at the more fundamental level, our means of knowledge. How do we know any of this? What is our means of knowledge? And Rand has really important material on all of this. We'll start with rights. Traditionally, it's held that rights come either from God or from government or in the better efforts to sort of understand what rights are and why we have them, they come somehow from nature. But in the history of the thinking on rights, natural rights ultimately were grounded in what's called natural moral law. Natural moral law. And this is spoken of by Locke. It's also spoken of by the founders. And what they mean by natural moral law is a law that comes from God. So this is not really natural moral law. It's supernatural moral law. It comes from supernature. That's where it comes from, right? That's the idea. So the idea that rights come from God, even if you try to ground that in so-called natural moral law, unless you can specify the natural moral law in a way that actually comes from nature rather than supernature, you're still just dealing with God-given rights. The rights come from God ultimately. So that brings us down to there only being, at least, there basically being two alternatives. Either rights come from God and then they're objective somehow, or they come from government, which means, well, governments can do whatever they want. They pass a law, those are your rights, okay? This is a bad set of alternatives. The idea that rights come from God is really unhelpful because in order to prove that you have rights, if they come from God, what do you first have to prove? That God exists, right? And since no one's ever proven this, and no one's ever even put forth evidence, the idea of evidence for God would obviate the need of faith, right? If you had evidence, there would just be, oh, well, here's the evidence for his existence. We don't need faith anymore. The reason religions hold on to faith is precisely because there is no evidence for God, yet they want people to believe in God. So faith is the way that you do that. Faith is precisely the acceptance of ideas in the absence of evidence. So since there's no evidence for the existence of God, and there's therefore no way to demonstrate that you have rights that come from God, that's a really weak founding for rights. In fact, it's a non-founding for rights. It's not going to serve our purposes. And this is why people have mocked rights throughout history. You know, Jeremy Bentham has called right nonsense upon stilts. And Alistair McIntyre says rights are one with witches and unicorns because there's an equal amount of evidence to support the existence of them, right? So then the other idea that a lot of people embrace is, well, rights just come from government, which I mentioned. But that's to equate rights with laws, right? Laws are what the government says you may and may not do. Rights, the whole purpose of the concept of rights is it's supposed to be something that precedes government, that precedes law, that exists before those things do, so that it can inform us about what laws should be passed. So it's more fundamental. It's a moral issue. That's why we have the two different concepts. Otherwise, we would just have the concept of law and there would be no concept of rights. Rand comes along and sees this chaos in rights theory, and she comes up with a theory of rights that is grounded not in supernatural law, but in the factual requirements of human life, the laws of causality and the laws of identity. We are a certain kind of being. We're a being that survives by means of our rational faculty. That's, you know, birds survive by flight. Other animals have their means of survival. We survive by using our reasoning mind. And Rand developed the whole theory of rights, which is based on this fact. And here's the fact. It's pretty straightforward, although it took a genius to figure this stuff out. I can state it to you pretty straightforwardly. The principle of rights, okay, it's a principle, it's an abstraction, so you're not going to go find it out there. It's not under a rock, and it's not in here. You can't cut me open and find it. It's a principle. The principle of rights is the recognition of the fact, now the fact is out there, of the fact that human beings live by means of reason. That's their fundamental means of understanding the world and identifying their values and pursuing their values. Therefore, in order to live as human beings, they must be free to act on that means of knowledge. It's the recognition of the fact that in order for human beings to live as human beings, they must be free to act on their means of living, their fundamental means of living, their reasoning mind. There you have the essence of Ayn Rand's approach to rights. She's just saying we're a certain kind of animal. That's the nature of what we are. By our very nature, we live that way. And if you stop us from, if you strap me to a tree, I can't act on my judgment. I'm going to die. If you put a gun to my head, I can't act on my, put me in a concentration camp, I can't act on my judgment, and so forth. If you take my property from me, I can't act on my judgment because now I can't use my property the way I plan to use it. All of the degrees of force are simply versions of the same thing. So the principle of rights says because people can't live as human beings when you do that, we have to extract that thing from social relationships. Got to get rid of it. So this is Rand's theory of rights. And I urge you, if you're not familiar with her theory, to read up on it. Read her essay, Man's Rights, and her other essay, Collectivized Rights, and another essay, The Nature of Government. Between those three essays from Rand, they're all available in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and at least two of them are also available in The Virtue of Selfishness, two of her books. So one of the things that I think Rand brings to the table for advocates of liberty is a solid, objective, fact-based theory of rights, where we know what they are, where they come from, and how we know that we have them. They don't come from God, they don't come from government, and they don't come from nature we know not how. They come from the factual requirements of the kind of animal that we are. The second thing that Rand brings to the table that I want to mention today is her understanding of morality, which is very different and really radical. Rand looked out at morality and the world and people thinking about morality, and she said, in effect, look, the starting place for this is not which one of these pre-existing moral codes is correct. The starting point for this is, do we need morality, and if so, why? Now look at the difference as soon as you ask that question about where your mind goes. Why do we need morality? Are there any facts that give rise to the need of this thing? Well, if there are facts that give rise to the need of morality, then whatever those facts are going to shed a lot of light on which values and which moral principles are correct and which are wrong, right? Because if something doesn't serve the purpose of morality, the reason that we need it, then it wouldn't be a good thing for morality. And if it does serve that purpose, then it would. So Rand goes through this really fascinating inductive discovery by asking this question and burrowing down. Instead of looking and grabbing at an existing moral code and saying, let's go with one of these because somebody already devised it, she says, do we need this thing, and if so, why? She comes to the conclusion, and I urge you to read her essay, The Objectivist Ethics, where she sort of spells this out. She comes to the conclusion that the reason that human beings need values is in order to live. Only living things pursue values, like rocks, rivers, and hammers don't go after values. Only living things do. Tigers, trees, and human beings go after values. Trees shoot their roots into the ground and turn their leaves toward the sky. They're taking action, right? They're after a value. They're trying to get something. Animals do the same thing, and we do the same thing. Now, of course, at the human level, things get complicated because we have free will and we can choose the things we want to go after. We don't go after them automatically. But these two facts remain. The only reason we can pursue values is because we're alive. And ultimately, the only reason we need to pursue values is in order to live. That's the purpose of values. It's the ultimate purpose. By means of this inductive discovery, Rand identifies the requirements of human life as the standard of moral value. The objective standard of moral, the factual reason why we need these things. This is huge. This is huge because what it means is that the living entity that needs to take action to live, you and you and you, your life is your ultimate value. You should pursue the values you need because that's the whole purpose of values. That's what they're for. And what this means ultimately, and this gives rise to Rand's radical idea, which is that rational egoism is correct as a moral code. You should use your reasoning mind, your means of living, to figure out what you need in order to live and thrive and have a wonderful life. And then you should pursue those things. That's the egoism part. Go after those things that your reasoning mind tells you you need to live a beautiful life. Now, we live for decades. We're not gnats. We don't live for a moment or a day. So we got to take the long range, wide range, really serious conception of what human life is. But if we do that, we can live beautiful lives by means of a series of principles within a moral code like this that tell us how to do that. Treat people justly as they deserve to be treated. Be productive. You need to produce in order to live, so be productive, and trade with others so you can get the things that they've produced, and so on. These are all principles of Rand's ethics. Now, this stands in sharp contrast to the ethics of altruism. Alter is Latin for other. Altruism means that you should live for others. Well, as the Frenchman who coined the term altruism pointed out, the idea of rights is completely incompatible with the idea that you have a duty to live for others. If you have a duty to live for others, you cannot simultaneously have a right to live for yourself. They're literal opposites. It's one or the other. And so this points to a fact about altruism, about traditional morality, that it is literally incompatible with the earlier thing we talked about, individual rights. If it's true that you need to act on your judgment and pursue your values in order to live, and other people need to do that too, then we should have a principle of rights. We should recognize that fact and raise that principle to the law of the land. Nobody is allowed to initiate force. But if it's not true that you should live for yourself, if it's instead true that you should be sacrificing for other people, morally speaking, then you have just given the socialists all they need to implement the political system that follows logically from that fact, right? But altruism isn't true, it's false. And that's why no one has ever been able to point out why any facts of reality that give rise to the idea that you must sacrifice for other people. I wrote a short essay called Altruism, the Morality of Logical Fallacies. You can find it online. And it points out the 6 reasons that are the alleged reasons of why people should sacrifice. And all of them are textbook logical fallacies, all of them. Whereas there is nothing but a world of facts out there that says you should pursue the values you need and respect the rights of others to do the same if you want to live a beautiful life in a free society where people trade and get along, right? So that's the second thing that Rand brings to the table, is an objective code of morality that not only provides you with really, really sound guidance for how to live a beautiful life, but also undergirds her theory of rights. It's essentially the same fact at 2 different levels. Egoism says you should pursue the values that will sustain your life, and you're the proper beneficiary of those values if you made them happen. And the principle of rights says, yes, because that's true, you must be left free to pursue your values, because you're a human being. That's what you got to do. So that's the second thing that I think Rand brings to us that I think is really important. The third thing that I think is really important is Rand's view of our means of knowledge. And as I said earlier, everybody's going to agree with everything I say, because I'm up here talking about Ayn Rand's ideas. So this is pretty simple stuff. There won't be anything controversial here. So this is where, I mean, look, Rand's egoism is radical enough and controversial enough. But when we go deeper in philosophy and start asking, how do we know? How do we know what's true? Well, here's an interesting fact. You have been using a particular faculty the entire time I've been talking today and the time everybody else has been talking. And you've been using that faculty to assess whether or not what I'm saying makes sense. And that faculty is reason. That's the faculty you've been using. You've been asking yourself, is this guy making sense? Do I know anything that this contradicts in reality? Right? You've been using the law of non-contradiction, the Aristotelian law of non-contradiction, the fundamental law of logic, as a tool to determine whether or not I'm making sense and staying consistent with the reality that you know exists. That's what it means to use reason, is to assess things by reference to observation, mental integrations, and the laws of logic. This is our means of knowledge, and on a certain level, everyone knows that this is our means of knowledge, right? No one is sitting in the audience today saying, do I feel that Craig is making sense, right? If you're asking that, you would probably be a little bit embarrassed if you realized that you had been asking that. You kind of snap out of it and go, yeah, no, my feelings are not my means of knowledge, right? Feelings are important, don't get me wrong. Emotions are one of the most important things in life. There are psychological means of experiencing our values. I mean, what could be more important than that? In fact, if you didn't have emotions, there'd be no point in using reason, because there wouldn't be anything to live for. Right? You want to enjoy this life. That's what it's all about. But emotions are not your means of knowledge. They don't tell you what's true and false. They just tell you how you feel, whether or not the feeling corresponds to something in reality or not, and whether or not your judgments that gave rise to that. Your emotions come from your preconceived judgments about what's good and bad, right? That's where they come from. And then you have an automatic reaction based on those preconceptions to the things that happen. Simple example, if you were at a baseball park, if there's a baseball game and you're a big baseball fan and your team is playing and they win, right? You value the team, they win, you feel a wonderful emotion, right? You feel joy because your team won. If your team loses, you feel rotten, especially if you bet a lot of money on the game, right? Then it gets even worse, right? So emotions are simply automatic reactions to our values, the preconceived values that we've already made. But they just don't tell us what's true and false. And so it's wrong to treat them as if they do. Another thing that's wrong to treat them as if they do is to treat it as if it's a means of knowledge is faith. I mentioned faith earlier, and the whole reason that we have and I don't mean, I have faith in that my wife will be home to cook dinner tonight as she usually does, which doesn't happen in our household, by the way. I cook, but anyway. So I have faith in my friend, or whatever, something like that. It's not. I mean the religious meaning of faith, right? The idea that you can know what's true by having faith, or a revelation, right? Just knowing, in effect. But we all know on some level that faith is not our means of knowledge. We really do. Even people who are religious, you're not assessing my thinking right now and what I'm saying right now with, does this comport with faith? Right? You wouldn't do that, because that's not how you determine whether what I'm saying is making sense or whether it's true. You use reason for that. It's also the reason that parents never tell their kids, look, just have faith about whether the car is coming down the street before you cross. No, it's look and use your head. Parents always tell their kids, think, Johnny, before you act, et cetera, et cetera. It's don't have faith before you act. They don't do that. And there's a really good reason parents don't do that, because we all know that when we really need to know something, it is our reasoning mind that we have to use, not just believing something in the absence of evidence, which is what faith is about. Now, if people want to have faith and have their religion, that's their business. That's not my thing, but it is absolutely not your means of knowledge. Now, why am I making a big deal of this in regard to liberty? Because if we accept the idea that faith or feelings, or consensus, by the way, you can add consensus in here too as a third alternative, the idea that consensus is a means of knowledge, which it is not. It was a consensus in antebellum South that slavery should be legal. It's still the consensus in parts of Africa that slavery should be legal. That doesn't make it so. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on consensus. That's just stupid. But faith is not a means of knowledge. And if we treat it as if it is a means of knowledge, here's the kind of trouble we get into. I can say, well, look, I have faith that you should convert to my religion. And I have faith that if you don't, I'm justified in forcing you to, or killing you as an infidel if you don't. Now, this is exactly what the jihadists did on 9/11. They had faith that they were right, that they had divine authority to kill infidels because they're infidels. And if faith is a means of knowledge, then they were right to do that. They knew that they were right. If they know, look, you're supposed to act on your knowledge. If you know that it's true, then you should act on it. Well, that's what they did. But of course, faith isn't a means of knowledge, and we know that it's not. So it's just so important to keep these things separate and to recognize what is and isn't our means of knowledge. Likewise, for laws passed in the United States and other countries. The whole idea that a freshly fertilized egg in a woman's uterus is somehow a living being with rights is literally an act of faith. Like you cannot, there's no connection to that and the whole idea of what rights are, and the fact that the whole concept of rights comes about historically because there are existing human beings trying to figure out how to deal with each other in a social context. That's what rights are. Yet you have laws being passed here in the United States on the idea that you can actually know that this thing has a soul and has rights when there's no evidence to support that whatsoever. So there, you take it another direction. The whole idea of socialism, of the idea that, look, granted the economics doesn't work, we can see that historically. Granted, all throughout history, every time socialism's been tried, there's been a mountain of corpses and rivers of blood, but this time, it's not gonna happen that way. This time, socialism is gonna work. There's no reason to accept that. It's an act of faith. And if we identify it as an act of faith, and if we recognize that we know that faith is not a means of knowledge, we can tell the people who advocate that, look, that's just not true, and there's no evidence to support that socialism is going to work again, or this time, excuse me. So this is controversial, obviously, and I'm not here to, I'm not here to say you have to accept these ideas. That's not the point. The point is to think seriously about this stuff on all three of these levels that I've been talking about here. Think seriously. It's your mind that has to decide what you think is true. I can't do. Nobody else can do that for you, and you can't do it for me, right? We're all independent thinkers with our own minds and our own capacities to make these kinds of observations, integrations, calculations, and ultimately decisions. But what I think Rand brings to us is a fresh perspective on all three of these things. Rights being factual requirements of human life in a social context, that we can actually see the evidence in support of these things. A moral code that instead of telling people to sacrifice their values, which is just obviously bad for your life, to give up the values that would make your life great, instead, she provides us a moral code that's based on the very reason that we need values to begin with. Don't give up your values, pursue your values, go after them, try to get those things that'll make your life great, and respect the rights of others to do the same so that they too can live a beautiful life and trade with you, and then we get along in harmony, right? It's a beautiful thing. And it's a radical code of morality because it's challenging the 2,500 years of Judeo-Christian ethics, but it also makes sense. And if it makes sense and it's good for your life, what else could you want out of a moral code? And then thirdly, this business of taking seriously reason as our means of knowledge. And again, that one's really the most important because that's the one, if you really do embrace reason, then your MO in life is to say, I insist that things make sense to me. They have to make sense to my reasoning mind or I'm not going to accept them. And if that's your MO in life, then you're going to keep your mind connected to reality, which is where you're trying to live. It's a magical thing. If your mind is connected to reality, then the decisions you make with your mind work in reality, right? They serve that purpose. So although these are radical and controversial ideas, I urge you to, if you've never read Ayn Rand, I urge you to read some of her work and take it, read it critically. I always advocate reading Rand or anyone else with sort of a book in one hand and a dagger in the other, right? Be ready to shred the bad ideas if they don't make sense to you, if she's not upholding reason and giving evidence and logical arguments in support of her ideas, shred it. But if you read her and you're like, oh my goodness, I'd never heard arguments like this before. This really makes sense. This is super clarifying. And now not only do I see how I can use my mind to understand morality, a morality that's good for me and for you and for everybody else to live in harmony, and all of that supports this concept of rights so that we recognize, oh, here's why force is wrong. It's not just an axiom that we pull out of the air. It's a fact based on a whole moral structure, all of which is supported by reason and evidence and logic. This is Rand's message to us. And I think it's a beautiful thing. So I urge you all to look further into her work. Just a quick last word. The books that I recommend, other than her novels, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, and We the Living, obviously very, very wonderful books, and so read those. But her nonfiction gets into some of the things I'm talking about today. In particular, I would name 3 books. Philosophy Who Needs It is just a wonderful book of essays about philosophy that I think is one of the best books ever put together. The Virtue of Selfishness, which sort of spells out her morality. It's got a intentionally provocative title, but I think when you read it, you'll see that it makes sense. And lastly, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, which is her PN to what capitalism is and why it's the right system for human beings and what's necessary to uphold this thing. So that's my message about Rand. I hope you all will read her, and thank you for sharing your ears for this half hour.